I'd like to welcome Brian Levine, ACT Parks and Conservation Services, and he's going to be giving an outline on the prescribed that his organisation has developed in conjunction with a number of other agencies around Australia. So over to you, Brian.
Thank you very much, Deb, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining. We'll just see if we can get things working here. Before I get started, I just wanted to acknowledge a few folks. First, I wanted to acknowledge Deb and her team at the Center of Excellence in AFAC, particularly Greg and the CEO. I'd also like to thank acknowledge the original team who came up with this tool, my manager, Scott Fakwa, Simon Hemer, and Tom Denman from National Park Wildlife Service. Additionally, want to acknowledge there's been a working group that's been working off the side for the last couple of years. I'd like to acknowledge them, plus the many talented fire managers across Australia who've contributed to the tool. And lastly, I just wanted to thank the Forest Fire Management Group, led by my manager, Neil Cooper, but also Murray Carter and Slip, Naomi Stevens, and from the past, Alan Goodwin, who all supported this tool getting off the ground, and also Delp's Department of Ladder Water and Planning, and in particular Matt Potter, who very early on believed in a tool like this and sort of embedded it in their practices. So with that, I just want to go over, I guess, what we'll go over today. So, why do we need another tool? What exactly is the prescribed burn decision support tool, which we refer to as the PB DST? I'd like to go through a demo of the tool, go through a case study, and then happy to open it up to questions and to talk to folks if they'd like to. So get into it. Prescribed burning. So why do we need another tool? Prescribed burning is a very, very important land management tool. I think many folks would agree that burns can be very complex and they involve a lot of variables, and from that there's a high level of risk anytime we look to implement a prescribed burn. As we sort of advance in this arena, prescribed burns are becoming even more challenging. Climate change is definitely becoming a factor. It's obviously decreasing some of our burn windows, and probably one of the larger challenges we have is smoke management. So how we deal with the public and smoke. From this, we're often asked a lot of difficult questions when it comes to implementing a prescribed burn, and that's sort of where the tool was born. And that was from a very operational perspective. We're often asked a lot of questions. Is it suitable to implement the burn? When is it appropriate to leave the burn? What are the sufficient resources that we need? Other questions that we've been dealt with, I think, is succession planning. So how do we deal with up and becoming DivComs or incident controllers? And how do we continue bringing them along? That came into play very early on. And I guess I also felt, and a lot of other people, that potentially there was a lack of tools because of all this. There was a lack of tools to support prescribed fire, mainly a structured go-no-go checklist, the ability to quantify risk, not only of escape, but also of smoke on a given day. Potentially needed assistance in determining what risk mitigation was needed. And most importantly, we wanted to utilize a national risk management approach. And I guess one thing that I've heard very early on, and one thing that was really important, was the notion that we only have one chance to get it right. Later on, I'll share a quote from an inquiry that was done in Margaret River, but I sort of believe that we're held to very high standards, and there's very little tolerance for error when it comes to prescribed burning. So if there's a big wildfire and we develop a strategy and we say, well, we'll burn out this ridge and extend the control line. If you don't get it right, if something happens, if the weather changes and the tactic doesn't work, well, you can just say, well, you give it a go. We're doing the best we can. If that occurs on a prescribed burn, I don't believe we have that luxury. So you only really have one chance to get it right when it comes to implementing a prescribed burn. So what exactly is the PB DST? Very simply put, it's really a decision support tool. As I mentioned, it's meant to assist in the operations. And one thing I really want to get across to individuals is it's nothing new. This tool is something that we've always done. It's just formalizing a process that we've had. I think a strength of the tool, which we'll show, is it allows the user to work in a systematic manner. So overall, if you're going to describe the tool, it's a consistent, transparent, quantifiable risk assessment tool which documents decision making. And as I mentioned, it focuses on the risk of escape and smoke. So the DST will provide risk mitigation advice based on this matrix that we have. And again, it helps succession planning, so building capacity. You know, a couple of years ago, we've realized that sometimes we can put young DivComs or incident controllers in difficult positions. They might not have the mental slides or the history that a more experienced DivCom.
You've got to dial in on a teleconference.
And so,
engaging the community.
Sorry, everyone. Could you just mute your phone unless you're Brian? We're getting some commentary coming in at the background. Thank you.
Thanks, Deb. Yeah, so succession planning. So I realized very early on, which was an intent of this tool, was to help with succession planning. So often we weren't supporting the younger DivComs or ICs in the field, and so by giving them a tool which they can utilize, which gives them some baseline information, it'll actually help them develop versus leaving them sort of to their own devices. So very much a succession planning. And I guess we were sort of looking at how we can create this at a national level, and that's what we've done as this tool has evolved over time. But it very much needs to be tailored to the local approach. So the DST is not meant to burden your process. It's meant to complement the burn plan. And we'll go over it in detail, but it's a 6-step process using ISO 3100 risk management principle and guidelines. And one of the strengths is it creates a support package for ICs. So you'll see a risk score and mitigation advice, predicted weather and fire behavior. So the burn planner or assessor can then provide this package to the IC or the ops manager of a unit, however your organization works. And they'll have the complete package to better make a decision as to whether you want to implement a burn on a given day. The tool was designed to be done a couple days before, or at least the night before ignition. And the way that we sort of use it in the ACT is we'll repeat it each day for subsequent days of ignition, and we use this information to feed into our incident action plans. So with that, I'd like to start with a demo of the tool itself. The one thing that we'll ask is, it might be good if there's a button that allows you to do full screen. It's a little square button there. If you push that button, you'll see the screen a lot better. I'm not quite sure what size everyone's using, so I'm conscious that someone might not be seeing everything that we're seeing. So hopefully everyone can see a picture of the tool. And what you might not see, I think, from this right now is that on the bottom, we'll just see if I can, we'll see if this will work. At the bottom of, it's an Excel spreadsheet is what it's built in. There we go. At the bottom of the screen, you'll notice there's a handful of tabs. There's a handful of tabs on the bottom. I'll just make quick reference that to the left of the context tab, there is an instructions tab, which gives the user sort of the background of the tool and also instructions on how you use it. And on the far right-hand side, there's also a setup tab. So the first time that you go to utilize this tool, you will need to just go to the setup tab and set that up, because you can link to the BOM's gridded weather if you so choose. But I'll just start at the context tab and bring a couple things to the attention. First off, as identified in previous inquiries, identifying the context is the first step of the risk process. And so we begin that doing here. So what you'll see, I suppose, a couple things to point out is on the top left-hand side, there's actually a help button that you can click on now, and this will tell the user the way in which you can fill out this context tab. The first step is downloading the weather. So you have the ability of 3 choices in which you can bring in the weather. You can download it, the top button, via just the FTP sites. The second button is the Phoenix downloader. And the third button would be if you are connected to like a server or you download your weather in one particular location, you can just push that button, which I will, and you'll see a little wheel spin. It looks like a donut on my screen, and you can update the weather. We'll just see how this goes. So when filling out the burn context, you'll basically put in a whole series of questions that are highlighted in blue. I'm having a tad of technical error here. Just stand by, please. Fantastic. So what I'd like to do here is actually go through a demo. So simply you go into the top and you'll put in today's date. That's the day that you're assessing the burn, and the project name, which is Black Mountain. I've already downloaded the weather, and so you can go in here and you'll add a lat long. If you look on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see that there's an update weather location. It's just got black text. The minute that you change the lat long, you'll notice that button then turns to red, which then says you need to update the weather. So watch what we'll do. Push that button and it'll circle again, and we'll see if this actually works, because I'm not quite sure it likes the screen sharing type thing. It doesn't. Not quite liking sharing the screen on here. Live trials are always very interesting. So as you click along here, you need to choose the fire behavior model that's most relevant to your project. And so for this is a forest burn, so it's we utilize leaflet 80. And then it asks the question, are your adjacent fuels similar? So this is going to help you down as you filter likelihood. So in this case, the answer is yes. The slope is 0 on this burn. There's a wind reduction of 3 and 12. So you fill it all in and you're ready to go. Now, to identify the context, we have a series of questions that we've come up with. And again, we're not trying to duplicate the burn plan, but there's a little bit of overlap between the two. One way in which we've sort of mitigated this is in the ACT, we've taken our burn plan, and the very, very back end here, we've added this context table to the burn plan, so during the planning phase, we can implement it in here. And when we go to start a project, we simply just copy and paste it in. And so you could do about 80% at least during the planning phase. Then there'll be a handful of questions that you'll need to fill out when you're doing the assessment. For example, providing the weather for the next 7 days. And the intent of this is that you can fill in the context, and you'll go in here to the right-hand side, and you would just say, well, reduce the fire hazard asset protection. That's really a low risk. And you'll go down the line. Working on the road, that's a bit of a risk for us. There's a lot of traffic there, so we might say high. And you'll continue all the way down the form, and this is really helpful for managers who might not have the time to read every single line, but at least they can see the highs, the lows, and medium to make that. I'll then call your attention to the bottom box, which allows the user to talk about any issues that might be arising. So this is an important spot where you can then document any issues. And if you're happy to proceed and you want to continue the assessment, you would then just go and say yes and no. If you decide to do no, you can just stop right there. So moving on to the next step, which is a likelihood. Again, this tool was developed from the ACT and New South Wales perspective, so the user would need to change the categories in here potentially for the first time of the setup. So what we've developed is a whole number of factors that we think mostly affect the risk of escape. And they're broken into a number of different categories. You have long-term conditions, there's a few in there, fuels, control line, the burn date conditions, and then the future weather. Now, we've been asked a lot of questions about, should you include this factor or that factor. One of the early intents was to ensure that we were just developing a very simple tool, and we could have 1,000 different factors, but that's just going to complicate it a bit and then take a lot longer to fill out this assessment. So very quickly, we just want to have the baseline, the minimum of what we think contributes to an escape. And again, the working team that we've had for the last couple of years has helped shape this. So you'll see a whole bunch of different factors, then separated into 4 different categories, low to very high. And so again, depending on where you live, you might need to change the ranges of some of these. But the intent is not to change it after the initial setup, because you want to assess each burn the same exact way. So there's 2 different ways in which you can choose it. So if we take this example of the Black Mountain burn, and again, I have 2 screens. So what I generally do when I'm filling this tool out is I will have the burn plan on one screen and the assessment on the other, and you're sort of going back and forth. So if we were going to do this one, I'll just do a couple examples. In the ACT, the 36-month rainfall decile, we're at average. We're getting into early autumn, and our KBDI is 25 to 62. So you have the ability to either click into the cell, or you can actually come in here. For example, if we look at the fuel moisture, right now it's a little bit wet, so we'll say it's 1. We had a whole bunch of rain. You can just push 1 and go enter. The fuels in this block happens to be very high, and then the adjacent fuels also very high. So you'll quickly go down and fill this out, and the score will be populated. A couple things to consider here is it's very important that you start from step 1 and work all the way to the end, because there's a couple questions. For example, the fuel moisture, that's represented here in the likelihood of escape, and it's also covered in smoke, so it will auto-populate the other page as well. The other thing to keep in mind is we've just added a grassland score, so I'll just click back to the likelihood tab and scroll up to the questions. You'll see line number 9, adjacent field type, is it similar? So as I made reference to that, it is. If I just went back and said, well, actually this forest is actually surrounded by a grassland, when you go to the likelihood tab, what you'll see is the adjacent field description is now a grassland description. So that's a new feature that I think is pretty good for folks who do some grassland burns. So that's just a little bit of a taste of the likelihood context. The other thing I'll point out is that we have a button here, and I'll just sort of scroll to make sure everybody can see it. It's on the right-hand side. It's called Toggle Weather View. So we'll just give this a go. But essentially, if you push this button, you'll have a secondary form show up. And of course, everyone has different screen sizes, so it doesn't. You'll have to adjust it. But essentially, what this allows you to do is you'll have the weather pop up on one screen, and you'll have the old hold button, trick, classic. Can anyone hear me, or no? We're on hold.
You're clear to me, Brian.
Clear to me with the music in the background.
Clear, Brian.
Clear.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you. Keep going.
We call that the old Tony Sherrill where I come from, so fantastic. So anyway, as you'll see, we'll keep going on. It's live TV. So basically, you can look and you can assess the weather as you're clicking through here. So I can see if we're going to do the assessment today. And again, you might not see this very well here because of the screen size. You have the ability to say, look at the weather today. The max wind is 23, so you can click on this button right here, and it shows that. So to get rid of that, you simply just push the toggle weather button again, and it will get rid of that assessment. Give it a second on your screen, and hopefully it'll come back, and there it is. So that's that. The next step is the consequence. So it's a similar type thing. We've developed a handful of factors separated into 4 different categories. And again, you'll simply just come in here. So for Black Mountain, it's within a K of population. It's an urban bush interface. Fire will impact and it will require defense, and so forth and so on. And it comes up with a score. The other thing to point out is we now have a clear selection button, so if in the future if you can do another assessment, you can simply push that button and it will erase it. The next tab now is the new module, which is smoke management. And so you'll see a couple boxes that are highlighted already, and that's because, as I made reference to before, a couple conditions that you put in at the likelihood tab for escape will auto-populate for smoke, except in this case, they'll be the inverse. So, for example, curing if you have high moisture, that decreases the chance of escape, but it's also, in the inverse, not good for smoke dispersion. So that's why it's a low in one case and a high in the other. So for the likelihood of smoke, we've come up with some weather parameters, and that's fog, mixing height, transport winds, and then some burn day wind, and also the forecast wind. This is obviously a work in progress, and we'll be trialing it this autumn, so we'll be happy to take some feedback and some comment as it's gone on. What we have tried to do on the bottom of this page is we have put in some links here, which we'll see if we can get that on the bottom of the screen. I think you can see a couple. So we do have a link to the BOM smoke management page, and also to MedEye, so you can get your data for your fog and your mixing height. And for Tasmania, there's the CSMS. So those are just links to help people so that while you're filling it out. In terms of consequence, what we're looking at here is what's the proximity of highly smoke vulnerable assets, both economic but also health, aged care facilities, schools, and so forth. And also important was probably the density of population and the sensitivity of smoke. So again, you'll just click on each one of these, and what happens is you then click on the next tab, and the risk matrices show up. So on the top would be the risk matrix for the escape of smoke. So you can see the likelihood and the consequence automatically populate there. It then comes up with a risk score based on the matrix you can see here. And from that matrix, if we finalize, this came out to be a moderate. It then comes up with some baseline mitigation advice that you might start to look at. If you scroll down to the bottom of this tab, you'll then see the results of the risk of smoke. And it does the same exact thing. So likelihood of consequence gives you a risk score and then some baseline mitigation advice. The last tab is the assessment and the outcome. And so again, it'll populate what your risk number and what your level is, and it shows you the baseline mitigation advice. But again, you'll see these gray boxes here, and these are really important, as I discussed on the context page, because again, it gives the user the ability to mitigate or to discuss what you have done or what you will do to try to mitigate that risk. So you don't necessarily have to use any of the advice that's provided, but that would be a good opportunity to say, oh no, in this case we don't actually need a full IMT, we'll have a short IMT, or we have more than sufficient resources, wherever it might be. These gives you 3 opportunities to do it. At the very bottom of the tab, you'll have the ability for the assessor to sign an overall assessment, and then your IC can sign as well. What we do is we push this button, save to PDF. It'll then create a PDF for you to use. We actually sign that and scan it in. So let's see if this works. Oops. And so in our project files, we'll have all the scanned copies of this, and we'll print them off and save it to hard copy as well. So this then gives you the complete package of what you'll do here. I'll just show you the one other thing that we'll get out of here. The final 2 things that this document does is it provides some baseline weather for you, again, to create that package. So here's the Black Mountain burn, and for folks who haven't seen this, you'll see obviously 7 boxes, a very colorful graph, and lots of colors. What you have here is you have hour by hour what they call gridded weather, forecasted weather from the Bureau of Meteorology. So you have date, time, the temperature, relative humidity, direction of wind speed, the FDI, and the fuel moisture calculation. And the way that it's color coded is it'll show you the hottest and driest and windiest parts of the day, and those are sort of highlighted in red. So, I mean, today at Black Mountain, the high temperature is 20, so it's just showing you that the hottest part of the day is there. So it's not necessarily based on a range of, we normally get to 40 or 35 or whatever it might be. So it's just going to show you what are my peaks and troughs of the day. And then for FDI, as you can see on Wednesday, we do have the FDIs color-coded to the fire danger system. So if it's low to moderate, it'll be green. If it's high, it'll be blue, and so on. And I guess the last column would be the fuel moisture. This is, if it's blue, we're saying it's too wet. Green might just be just right, and red could potentially be too dry. The top box has a 7-day meteogram, so it's got a whole bunch of different factors showing you for the next 7 days. The last tab on the document is the fire behavior tab, and so this is not meant to be just for FBANs or fire behavior analysts. I think any IC would be good for them to see what type of baseline fire behavior they might expect. On the top left-hand side, again, it makes reference to the fire behavior model that you left, and you'll see rates of spread, fire intensity, and flame height as 3 different categories, and then it's split into 3 different time frames. And those time frames are based on the likelihood boxes. So these are the max values you might see over those different time categories. The lower prescription summary, that's going to give you the average fire behavior that you're likely to see throughout the next 7 days. And so the green on the left-hand side are the hours within prescription, and the average flame height and rate of spread. And then items in red or the times that you're over prescription. On the right-hand side, you'll see a series of graphs, and this all corresponds to this box up here, which is your prescription. So you simply click on that cell, and you can change your minimum and maximums, and depending on the value, whether it's, let's say, for example, temperature, it's the maximum. When you that max value is tied to that red line. So if you change the line from 30 to 25, you'll see the red line there, and that's what's being shown on this bottom graph right here, the prescription. So again, there might be times that you want to burn when it's in red, and that's why you have the other 4 graphs. You can say, okay, well, my wind speed is just out for 1 hour. We're happy to continue during that time. So that's the final tab on there. I'll just go back to the slides. So looking at the lessons learned from the DST since we've been using it, a couple of key things we've come up with. One is the DST, the ability to consistently document our decision making based on the best available information. That's been very important, and this has been validated following several burn escapes and also a number of contentious prescribed burns. The ability to present a detailed summary of decision-making has been invaluable. I think if you've ever been caught in the crosshairs, you won't be sort of trying to explain what you did to someone who has a deep knowledge of fire behavior or prescribed burning. You'll probably be talking to folks who don't know very much about fire, and so it's very important that, or what we've seen is to create this package and just reinforces the notion that written documentation is much better evidence for justifying decision making. And I suppose my belief, having worked not only here but in the United States, is that your agency is really only going to back you if you can demonstrate that you've used best management practices and did what most folks would have done in your same situation. The DST really is to support you. It shouldn't be thought of as a burden. It really should be thought of as a tool that's going to help you very strategically go through, systematically reviewing the various factors so you can make sure you have all your I's dotted and your T's crossed. So I'll just give you an example of one of the cases we had. And so you'll see here 7 days weather, and hopefully it's shown up on your screen okay, but what we were faced with is we had a whole bunch of different burns going at the same time, and we were trying to decide whether it was appropriate to light one more burn, one rural burn. And when we looked at the weather on day, would have been day 3 or day 4, there was going to be a little bit of a spike, and we were going to have FDIs get into the 12 to 15 range, and RHs get maybe as low as the 20s or mid-20s. Based on the burn itself and the distance from the ridge to the road, we did the DST. It came up with the fact that it was possible, the likelihood was possible, the consequence was moderate, and it came up with a risk value of 2. So we made the decision to go ahead. Unfortunately, what happened is the weather changed, and it changed quite dramatically. So I'll refer you back to the table on the left-hand side. Is from the 3rd of April, the 5:15 gridded weather, and you'll see we've highlighted the FDIs of anywhere from 12 to 12.4. If you look on the right-hand side, the morning of the escape, the FDIs were then predicted to go as high as 28. So we're obviously tracking the weather and using the DST every single morning to find out. So as the FDI started to increase, we actually changed our strategy. We documented that we changed our strategy. We stopped actively lighting and went to a little bit more of a defensive strategy. So we only lit in areas to increase the depth on our weakest control lines. What actually happened on the day was that the max FDI was 36. Winds were recorded as up to 50 to 70 kilometers per hour, and we had some local channeling in the area as well. And we were told that it was one of the hottest days in Canberra for autumn in over 30 years. So those are the type of things that are really hard to predict, and so it goes back again to that decision making and the ability of making a decision and documenting the decision that you are using the best information available at the time. So I suppose, just to summarize, and I'll refer to that quote that I was mentioning at the very beginning, fire managers are being held more accountable, and greater accountability that brings with it higher expectations of fire manager performance and lower thresholds for failure. Bush fire management is often high profile, high risk, and high consequence. So again, I think we need another tool because the game has changed and it's become more complex. This tool is really to support you in your decision making and to help reinforce that decision making, and ultimately to help your workforce with succession planning to give that experience. So, for example, with that PDF package, we provide that to people in the field via Google Drive, and they're able to open that up and look at it in the field as well. And it can help them shape, which flank is most important to mop up in it, to what depth. And so I'll leave it at that, and thanks for taking the time to sign in and watch this, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Thanks, Brian. Does anybody have any questions for Brian? Take that as a positive sign, Brian, that you thoroughly covered off on all issues. So,
sorry, Deb, Tim McNaught. Brian, just with the weather update, is it an auto update that links into Med-Eye? I'm just wondering if you could describe the tab that you wanted to tap onto to update weather update. If you could just, I guess, verbally brief us on how that would work.
Yeah, so I apologize for that. I don't think the tool actually likes being on a screen sharing type thing. So I'll just switch back and show you very quickly screen sharing here, monitor. Hopefully you'll see. So it gives you the, did it work? No. Yep, there you go. So it gives you the three different options. The first option is the FTP site. So, depending on which agency you work for, firewalls can be quite difficult. So we actually have an issue with trying to get to the FTP site. It doesn't timestamp the document real well. So if you click on that top button, it'll pulse the FTP automatically. It'll bring it in and unzip it. And so it's not Med-Eye, it's the ADFD gridded weather from the bomb. So for the ACT, for example, we're broken into six kilometer grids. So it'll pull the weather, so that's where the lat long comes in. You also see the blue box on the right-hand side. This lets you know that, I work in the ACT and the lat long is in the ACT. So if you make a mistake on your lat long, it might say, for example, that you're in New South Wales, and it won't like that. So there you go. It'll highlight to say you just made a mistake. The second button is if you use Phoenix or you have that ability, you can click on the weather downloader and it pops up the box automatically for that. And the third button again is we now download our grids to one central location and we point the directory to that. So essentially, if you go to the Setup tab, which I wasn't going to go into, but I can very briefly, it allows the user to then decide which way you want to bring in the weather. So you just click on here and you say which state or territory you're from, and you can click that in here. I also want to acknowledge at this point, I suppose, Fred coming. I forgot to mention him in the beginning. Fred is the individual who has done the design on here, so this tool would not be anywhere if it wasn't for Fred's hard work and his skills and knowledge. So he just comes up with fantastic tools, and to be able to take, weather that's just raw data and turn it into something very easy to digest for firefighters, like these color-coded boxes, I think is a fantastic advancement in our field.
Thanks for the weather update there, Brian. Cheers.
Yep. Any other questions?
Brian, there's a couple of questions on the screen. Rochelle would like to know, is version 5 still in draft?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So version 5 is no longer in draft, and following this webinar, we'll be releasing it nationally for people to use. I'd just like to show Rochelle here. For folks, one other thing I didn't mention, we'll see if it works. One other thing I did not mention here is for folks in Tasmania, where it's also complicated potentially, is we now have enter your own weather button here. So you can click on this and it automatically takes you to the spot where you can drop in this created weather and then go back to the context tab from there. So we'll be releasing version 5 later today, tomorrow, and we'll be sending it out to the working group. I should probably show at the end that let's go to the last slide, which is people can send me an email if you're interested in the tool as well.
There's another question from Scott who said, would you consider converting to web app to enable access and live download in the field?
Scott, that's a very good question. I think the answer is potentially yes. I mean, we've considered this to be a trial. We're constantly reaching out and talking to people across Australia and even to folks in Canada and US a little bit about this, and so there has been a little debate about what is the best medium for this. I think a web could be very good at some point. There can be difficulty in downloading the weather from the Bureau, so that potentially could simplify it. So I think the short answer is potentially yes, and we'll see what most people would like to have, whether it's Excel or a web-based version.
Okay. Any other questions for Brian?
We're also looking for developers who can put it on the web potentially as well. There's a shout out maybe.
Yeah, I've got a question. Glenn Daniel here. Your lessons learned screen here shows an example where the forecast FDI differed from the actual FDI in the day. Yep. Do you have any examples of where the risk assessment process has been a benefit?
It's just about over this now.
I just missed the last bit. So the last part was, have we ever realized where the risk assessment has been? Can you repeat that last bit?
Has been of benefit, because it seems like there's quite a bit of effort in putting in those likelihood and consequence scores. I'm just wondering if you've got any examples of where that's proven beneficial.
Yeah, I think, to me, I suppose, one of the most important things is just the ability to actually, I don't have a specific example, so I'll just say that what I've found most important is the actual ability to just document what you're thinking. And so, like, from this example, the consequence was not severe, so therefore, having an escape, while it's not ideal, and we had some higher intensity fire behavior for a little bit, just being able to put in the different factors for the risk gave us that confidence to go ahead, because at the end of the day, we just burned a little extra bush. And so I know there's been some folks that had some contentious burns. They were called to question about it, and they were able to show due diligence of what they've done by using the different risk factors on there. And then those gray boxes where they're able to document, we've done X and we've done Y. And that really, again, because you hand it to the layperson, a minister or a director or whatever it might be, who might not have that detailed fire background, and they can very, very clearly see in a layperson's perspective that you did due diligence. And again, that's where the context is very important. You know, the context, whether good or bad, can really satisfy people for why you did the burn, for example. So you might have severe weather, but you might have a limited opportunity to implement the burn because of it's adjacent to a high assets or something like that. So you might not have the ability to just choose the next weekend. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks.
Brian Neil Cooper.
Yeah.
You might want to mention just, it's quite complex when you go through it on a webinar, but the time it takes someone to go through the process to come up with an output for the IC.
Yeah, that's a very good point. What we've done in the ACT, again, is we've tied our burn plan to this. So I guess for each jurisdiction, you have to decide, how you can integrate this into your systems. Because again, the workload is becoming higher, but we're not actually getting more people to complete this work. So we've mitigated it by putting the context table in the burn plan. So obviously, when you're doing the burn plan, it takes an additional 5 minutes to write the context. When you do the first assessment, it probably takes about 20 minutes the first time you do it, but when you start doing a lot, it's only about 15 minutes to do the baseline assessment. And then if you're going to do it on subsequent days, it's only about 5 minutes each time, because all you have to do is update the weather. Most of the factors are going to stay the same. The context will most likely stay the same. And so you're really looking at 15 to 20 minutes or 5 to 10 minutes on subsequent days. And I guess my argument to people who say, well, we don't have the time is, if refer back to an earlier slide, these are things we do anyway. Before you light a burn, you're going to be looking at the weather in detail. You're going to be reviewing different things to decide whether it's appropriate to start the burn or continue the burn. So overall, I think it's a pretty short period. We have talked about whether you want the weather to auto-populate the form, and the working group sort of voted against that because, again, it then becomes a tick and flick type exercise, and again, we haven't locked the door on that, so there's always the future to change. But at this point, you're thinking you really want to interrogate the weather and make sure you're happy with that before you decide to go.
Okay, any further questions for Brian? Okay, well, thank you very much, Brian, for presenting for us today.